I'm David Ringstrom, a CPA in Atlanta, and welcome to our fourth installment on our series that is serving as an introduction to macros in Microsoft Excel. This time around, we will be focusing on user forms in Excel. User forms are an object that we can add to our workbook that allows us to create custom dialog boxes. So we'll see how to create a simple input box at the end, but we're mostly going to work our way toward that by putting together from scratch a user form that will allow us to make it easier to pick and choose which worksheets that we want to print within a workbook. So that will allow us to lay our hands on a lot of different aspects of building user forms. We'll also build on creating some loops, because we'll have to loop through the workbook to create our list of worksheets. So it should pull together a lot of the material that you've already covered in this series and allow you to apply it in new ways. I'd like to give you some background about the version of Excel I'll be teaching from, because the way that we pay for software has evolved over the years. Historically, we bought a perpetual license for software, which meant that we would pay once for the software and then use it as far into the future as we would like. But things have evolved, and more software is being purchased or licensed on a subscription basis. And so that's why Microsoft has the Office 365 version. Historically, there hasn't been, not that Office 365 has been around that long, it's been around for a couple of years now, but historically, up to this point, there hasn't been much difference between the Office 365 version and, let's say, Excel 2016 or even Excel 2019. Going forward, though, Office 365 is going to start being dramatically different than what I'm terming the legacy versions of Excel, which are any version of Excel that have a year number in their name. In Office 365, we're going to be getting a new calculation engine, which means that the way that formulas will calculate much faster, we'll be able to do dramatic new things with formulas that previously have required menu commands. And so lots of exciting changes are on the horizon for Office 365. So if you're using an older version of Excel and considering moving to a later, and more current version, rather than following your historical pattern and just getting the Excel 2019, that version of Excel honestly is already obsolete. There are changes coming to Office 365 that will not be added to Excel 2019. The legacy versions of Excel with the year number, those are frozen in time. Those aren't evolving. So the Office 365 version updates sometimes monthly, sometimes a few months go by before they add changes, but it's constantly being improved, and so that's where Microsoft is putting all their efforts. With regard to today's material, if there is anything that I cover that's specific to a version of Excel, I'll bring that to your attention. Most of what I talk about in my presentations, I try to cast a wide net and cover things that are applicable to as many versions of Excel as possible. But obviously at various points, I sometimes need to just cover something that's brand new so that everyone can take advantage of the new functionality. With regard to my training style, you'll see that I will show you everything at least twice. I'll first walk you through it on the PowerPoint slides, which are very detailed and have numbered steps. Then I'll go to the Office 365 version of Excel and carry out those techniques firsthand. The handouts for today do include a PDF of today's presentation as well as the example workbook. Also, within that example workbook is a related articles tab that has links to articles I've written that relate to today's material. So I do try to leave you with a lot of takeaways from choosing one of my presentations. If we're going to work with user forms in Excel, then we have to utilize the Visual Basic Editor. The Visual Basic Editor is the programming interface within Excel. To display the Visual Basic Editor, the first step, if you have enabled the developer menu in Excel, then step 2, you can choose the Visual Basic command that will always launch the Visual Basic Editor. There's also a keyboard shortcut we can always use, which is Alt F11. So when we press Alt F11, that also displays the Visual Basic Editor. The Visual Basic Editor looks like it's a separate program that we've launched, but really we're still in Excel. We're just in a separate specialized window in Excel. Two other aspects that you want to make sure are currently displayed on your Visual Basic Editor are the Project Explorer and the Properties window. We'll definitely be making use of both of those with creating user forms. So step 4 shows that if these two aspects are not already displayed, you can go to the View menu. Step 5, you can choose Project Explorer. You can then go back to the View menu again and then turn on the Properties window. The Project Explorer allows us to work behind the scenes of our workbooks, and in this series we've used it to manage module sheets. So we'll be adding a new type of object there, which will be user forms. The properties sheet we haven't made much use of yet, other than to rename our module sheets, but we will be using the properties window more extensively in the course of building user forms in Excel. To see this in Excel, if you have a developer menu, developer tab, it will be toward the right-hand side there. You can go to Developer and click Visual Basic. That will display the Visual Basic Editor. If your Visual Basic Editor is blank, such as mine is at the moment, you can then go to the View menu, choose Project Explorer. This gives you the ability to browse around within workbooks and see if there are any module sheets, and also look at any macros within there, and also see any user forms. We'll be adding some user forms. We'll also go back to the View menu, turn on the Properties window. So this is going to allow us to manage various properties of objects that we'll be placing on our user forms. In order to create a user form, we're going to put our first user form inside our personal macro workbook. If you don't have a personal macro workbook, you can use any Excel workbook. To create a personal macro workbook, you must first use the macro recorder and have the macros saved in the personal macro workbook, which we've covered previously in this series here. So I'm going to right click on my personal.xlsb workbook. Step 2, I will choose Insert, and then Step 3, I will choose User Form. So this is going to add a blank user form into this workbook, which will be the blank canvas for me to create a dialog box if I choose. In Excel here, in the Visual Basic Editor, I have my personal.xlsb file, so it's my personal macro workbook. I can right click, I can choose Insert, and then I can click User Form. So this gives me a blank user form, nothing on it yet, so it is indeed a blank canvas. Also notice there is a toolbox that has controls that we can add. So this toolbox may appear automatically, or you may have to activate it. As we'll see, there is a button on the Visual Basic Editor for the toolbox. We click there. We'll be exploring a number of different objects that we can add to our user form. To begin here, we see that when we do insert a user form, we then gain a Forms folder within our Project Explorer. So you will only see a Forms folder within workbooks that have user forms added, just as you will only see a Modules folder within workbooks that have macros within them. To display the user form on the screen, you can either press the F5 or you can click the green arrow on the toolbar. That will display the form on the screen. When we do so, this form isn't going to have anything listed in it because it's a blank canvas, but we will be able to click the X to close that form. So the toolbox button we can see on the toolbar there, we'll click that to display the toolbox that has the controls that we'll add to our form that will actually add some interactivity. Here in Excel, if I either press the F5 key that displays my form in Excel, and I can click close here. I could also click the run button here, or so the F5 key launches it. The run button here also displays the form there. So when you're creating a user form, you may periodically want to test it and see what it looks like as you're putting everything on the screen there. That's how we can temporarily test it. And ultimately, we'll be adding buttons to it and other objects and being able to launch this form inside Excel. You can always also test it from within the Visual Basic Editor. Let's now take a look at some of the most common controls that we might add to our form. And a very common form is a label. So that's the second icon on our controls list here. And when we click that icon, we can then go over to the user form, and if we just click, we'll place a label. We can also hold down the left mouse button and draw a bigger rectangle if we want to expand that label. So labels are typically informational captions. Now there are situations where in the past I've used labels as uneditable fields. As you get more experience with Excel, you'll see that you can programmatically change the caption of a label. But since we're working at an introductory level, we'll be manually changing the caption of our labels. To add a label to my user form here, I will click the label button. So notice if you hover over the toolbox, you get to see what these different objects do, what functionality they offer. So we'll click label here, come over here. If I just left click, it adds a label there. If I were to come back over here and hold down the mouse button, I could make a bigger label if I wished. Notice that when I click on it, I gain little selectors here, and so I can resize it as needed. I can also resize this. If I decide to remove it, I can right click and I can choose delete, and that will then delete it off of the form there. So typically I'm going to use labels as descriptors surrounding other objects within my user form.